All right, good afternoon. Welcome to Wild at Work. My name is Megan Pineda. I'm the Adult Education Specialist here at Texas Wildlife Association. Joining us today is Blaize Korzekwa. Blaize is a white-tailed deer program leader for Texas Parks and Wildlife. He oversees a white-tailed deer management programs, the MLDP or Managed Lands Deer Program, and other regulatory changes across the state of Texas. He previously served as the Parks and Wildlife biologist for Dimmitt, Frio, and Zavala counties, as well as Karnes and Wilson counties. Blaize was raised on a ranch near Gillette. The ranch that he was raised on centered around a cow-calf operation, but also had a strong emphasis on managing native white-tailed deer and quail. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Biology from Texas State University, followed by a Master of Science in Range and Wildlife Management from Texas A&M University in Kingsville. He did his work through the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute, where he researched white-tailed deer in South Texas. He's also served on numerous committees and boards, including the Cervid Working Group for the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Board of Directors for Texas Brigades, a past president and current instructor of the South Texas Buckskin Brigade, Texas Big Game Awards Scoring Committee Chair, various county youth leadership advisory boards, and committee positions in the state and the Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society. Blaize and his wife have 3 young children and currently reside in Wilson County. Before we get started today, I'd like to remind everyone here to please keep your microphones muted throughout the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please post that question in the chat. We'll do our best to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Blaize, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share and let you share your screen, and you will have the floor from here.
Thanks, Megan. Let me share. Does that look good, Megan?
Yes, sir, we've got you.
All
You're
right.
full screen.
Thanks, Megan, for the introduction. As she said, my name's Blaize Korzekwa, Whitetail Deer Program Leader, and I'm going to touch on really some deer data, some population data, harvest data, and then close out with a season forecast and some other information. As you guys all know, when it comes to hunting and just land ownership, Texas is a very unique state. I've traveled to several deer meetings throughout the Southeast, and Texas always stands out as being rather unique. And a lot of that is through private land ownership. It's something we're obviously very proud of. 95% of Texas is privately owned. And within that, there's a little over 113 million acres of what we consider suitable white-tailed deer habitat. That doesn't mean there's deer that don't live in other areas, such as urban areas or maybe some less suitable habitat. But so Texas has a lot of country, and we have a lot of deer that live out here. And part of what makes Texas unique is obviously the habitat types and everything, but the precipitation. When we go to other states, the precipitation is not near as wide of a difference that we have in Texas. You can get nearly 60 inches in East Texas to as little as 8 out in the Trans-Pecos. So you can kind of see on the map where you fall. And some years we have an average year, some years we're drought, some years we're wet. But this is a good idea of what average looks like. And because of those rainfall variances and the different soil types and everything in Texas, we have about 9 or 10 different ecoregions. These are really broad. Most folks know, like, hey, I hunt in South Texas, or I hunt in the hill country or the rolling plains. That's what this really encompasses. But you can look at an even finer scale and look at the different vegetation types. These are still pretty broad classifications. And then on an even finer scale is local ecological types. Those are going to be specific to your ranch. I don't have a map for those just because there's so many of them, but really to sum this up, the state is a vast different array of habitat types, precipitation, and things like that. And because of that, when we manage deer in Texas, we manage deer at the deer management unit level. We call it a DMU. You can look at here and get an idea of where you hunt at just based off of where you are in the map. But when it comes to those DMUs, they cover sometimes entire counties or portions of counties. Sometimes there's a county that may be split by multiple deer management units. And as far as Texas goes, we manage deer at that level. A lot of times people may ask that, hey, why don't we change this bag limit only in this county? Because we manage the population at a much bigger scale than that. And then what we'll do is we'll take regulations and apply it to all those counties that fall within that DMU. And some of those counties that may be split will just decide, hey, is this regulation a good fit for this county or is it not? And some of those, for example, would be our deer hunting zones. So we have a north and a south zone. Typically, the south zone is what people refer to as South Texas, but you can see those follow those DMU boundaries pretty well. And in some cases, there's county splits, such as along Highway 90, because as soon as you cross 90, you start to enter the Edwards Plateau. But in other cases, such as the border there of Atascosa and Wilson and Karnes County, we just use the county line because there's not a big shift in the habitat change there. And we also use those deer management units for regulations such as doe days, in which some of those counties have restricted seasons in which they can use a rifle to harvest does. You'll see there in the purple, that's our 4-day doe season. That kind of army green color is a 23-day doe season, and that turquoise is a full season. And that's based off of the data we have at the deer management unit level and just trying to determine if that population can withstand a heavier doe harvest. Also within those DMUs, our staff conduct numerous surveys throughout the late summer, early fall. They're currently conducting the 2025 surveys right now as we speak, and they'll wrap that up towards the end of October. But you'll see 2016 and earlier, we used to survey every single route every single year. And then beginning in 2017, we actually increased the number of deer management units, and then we also increased the number of survey routes. So that gives us a lot more confidence in our population. So it's a lot tighter confidence intervals with those estimates. But you can see that population has been over 5 million for quite a while. In 2022, it dipped down because we were in such severe drought conditions. And I'll touch on some of that later on. But looking at last year's surveys, we were just over 5 million white-tailed deer. So quite a few deer. We're by far the most deer populated state in North America. Our staff also collect herd compositions in which we look at the sex ratio and the fawn crop. And this is statewide. So different ecoregions have different sex ratios, but statewide, last year was our highest doe to buck ratio on record in the last 2 decades, about 3.7 does per buck. But I will state that our surveys this year have shown a better sex ratio, closer to about 3 to 1. And that's largely due to our hunters last year harvested about 100,000 more does than they had the year before. And so that's going to benefit that sex ratio. And although on an individual ranch, we obviously try to manage for a much better sex ratio, you have to consider this is statewide. This is everybody who may manage or may not manage. And all they do is they hunt on the property. And we also collect data on fawn recruitment. So the last 2 years have been really good fawn recruitment statewide. That 47% and 44, those were the highest 2 years in about the last decade. But you'll see some dips in there, specifically 2011. And if you all recall the severe drought conditions we had in 2011, and then also 2022, we had severe drought conditions at that time, and that fauna recruitment is determined off of those habitat conditions that we have during the spring and the summer months. So just looking back at what happened in 2022, this is an image of the drought conditions with that dark maroon being considered exceptional drought. So to get to these conditions in June, we were obviously in drought conditions all throughout the spring. So that's the time for antler development. Those does are trying to put on some fat reserves so they can nurse those fawns when they get born later in the summer. And when you have conditions like this, it just lends itself to a below average fawn crop, which is what we saw in 2022. This data here it's the same data as that statewide deer population where we had around 5 million, but it's split amongst all the ecoregions in Texas. So you can see the bulk of the deer population actually lives in the Edwards Plateau. About 30 to 40% of the state's deer population lives there in what we call the hill country. So anytime there's a big change in the population there, that tends to lower that statewide estimate quite a bit. But if you look at the other ecoregions, they're all either stable or in some cases even slightly increasing, such as in South Texas and a little bit in the Blackland Prairie. And some of the reason for the decline in the Edwards Plateau was around that 2019, 2020 timeframe. We had a anthrax outbreak on the western edge of the Edwards Plateau. That certainly hurt deer populations there. And then since then, it seems like they've just been in perpetual drought conditions every spring. We're all aware of the unfortunate heavy rainfall that they had there this summer, but really leading up to that in the spring, they were technically still under some severe drought conditions. This map shows those same deer management units, but with the acres per deer assigned to it. So the darker that orange, the more dense the deer population is there. So you can see a lot of that focus is in that Edwards Plateau ecoregion. And then once you get to East Texas, it gets a little lighter deer density just because of the habitat type that's there. But one thing to note is this isn't the deer density on your property. This is the density for the entire deer management unit. Obviously, some places are going to be higher than that number, and some places are going to be lower than that number. But it's a good idea on maybe how do you compare to that DMU as a whole. So if you know your deer density, it's a good figure to kind of look at and say, okay, I'm above what everybody else is around me, or I'm below that number. Our statewide deer harvest is shown there in orange, and our total number of deer hunters is shown there in blue. So you can see we harvest a lot of deer every year. This is from hunting license harvest as well as MLD harvest. Last year, for reference, we had about 763,000 deer hunters who harvested 837,000 white-tailed deer. And in some years it gets higher than that. In some years it's a little bit lower, but it's a relatively stable line. It's been slightly increasing over the last 2 decades, but there's obviously some up and down years in there, and much of that just depends on what's the quality of the habitat that season, what's the condition of the deer population, and then also what was the fawn crop in prior years, because that's going to be a good indication of how many middle or mature bucks are going to be out there this year. But just for reference, we average about 1 to 1.1 deer harvested per hunter. So it sounds like it's not a lot, but when you have this many hunters, it does add up to be quite a bit. The average age of our harvested deer has improved by about half a year over the last 2 decades, down to about 3 years of age, up to about 3.5, 3.6, which is a good indication that hunters have become aware of, hey, there's benefits to letting deer get older. Those older does tend to be your better mothers. They tend to raise fawns successfully, as well as raise twins sometimes. And then bucks, we all know as bucks get older, they get larger antlers. And it's been a benefit for hunters to be aware of. And then we also have some regulations that have helped with that as well. We also collect data on the age structure, and we take antler measurements and things like that every year on thousands of bucks and does that are harvested. But just looking at that, I'm at the bucks for this one, you'll see almost half of the bucks harvested every year are considered middle age, that 3.5 to 4.5 year old range. But then one a good trend has been the upward trend of mature bucks, those 5.5 year old bucks being harvested. Where 2 decades ago, it used to be less than 10%. Now we're up almost to 30% in some years. And then below that, we have 1.5 and 2.5 year old deer. The downward trend in 2.5 year old deer has been very promising because folks are letting those deer walk. They're letting those deer get another age, another year or two on their age. The 1.5 year old buck harvest tends to fluctuate just depending on if they're seeing any spikes. We all know some hunters still harvest spikes. In some counties, those with antler restrictions, they're allowed to harvest one buck with a inside spread that is large enough, and then a second buck that is a spike. So sometimes those numbers will go up and down just depending on how many spikes are out there that season. We also have that data for different ecoregions. So some of the stuff I pulled out is just from South Texas because that's what I'm most familiar with. But we have this data for every ecoregion in the state. But you can see some differences compared to the statewide harvest. South Texas tends to harvest some older deer. Almost 40 to 50% of their buck harvest are those mature bucks, 5.5 and older. And then just below that are those middle-aged bucks. We also collect data on what percent of the harvest is bucks that are 4.5 and older. And the reason we use 4.5 is because by that point, those bucks are going to be finished growing their skeletal system. So their frame is about as big as they're going to get. As they get older, they tend to put on a little bit more muscle. And then once they hit about 6 or 7, they tend to put on some more fat at that point. But it's a good indication on if hunters are letting those deer get to an age that it will allow them to reach a level of the buck age structure that's more natural, but also give them the opportunity at harvesting a higher scoring buck. So the Blackland Prairies is that top graph. You'll see they've improved quite a bit through time and have been between 30 to 40% the last few years. Cross Timbers has been doing well. They're about that 40% harvest since, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago when they met that. But each of these graphs you're going to see has increased over time. And that's the whole goal with hunters is them realizing, hey, there's benefits to letting these deer get older, and they're starting to recognize those benefits. The Trans-Pecos, you'll see it's a little bit more spotty. It's got a lot of up and down, but they're still around that between 40 to 60% mark. Just the reason they tend to fluctuate a lot is because the sample size is smaller. That tends to be more mule deer habitat rather than whitetail habitat. The Edwards Plateau, you'll see, has increased quite a bit through time. They're around that 50% mark. And one thing you'll see in a lot of these charts is a drop around that 2015 and 16 season. That's simply due to the drought we had in 2011, in which there were very few fawns born. So now you're missing that buck age class as the seasons progress. And then eventually, when 2015 came around, those bucks are now 4.5 years old, but there's not many of them left. So it's lowered that a little bit there. But we're starting to catch up thanks to some better fawn crops. The two rolling plains ecoregions have done quite well. They're around that 50% mark in the eastern half of the rolling plains and between 50 to 60% in the western rolling plains. That western rolling plains has been a really good area in recent years for mature buck harvest. It's really kicked off around that Shackelford County area. And that's just big ranch country out that way. So they're able to let those bucks hit some of those older age classes. And we'll also put two different ecoregions on some graphs just to show the differences that a ecoregion can have on that mature buck harvest. So we have the piney woods shown there in blue and South Texas shown there in orange. You'll see those piney woods, they struggle to hit that 30% mark. And a lot of that is just based off the hunting pressure there. That's some of the highest concentration of deer hunters in the state. And then on top of that, the acreage they hunt on is not as big as South Texas. But just like the Edwards Plateau in South Texas, you see that drop off in 2015 and for a few years after that. That's due to those lower fawn crops that they had in that 2011 timeframe, to where now those bucks, as they start to age into that 4.5 and older age class, there's just not many bucks there to harvest that are that old during those past seasons. The Post Oak Savannah is the last one I'll have on here. It's been a really good success story. They've essentially doubled their older buck harvest in the last 2 decades. So you can see that that trend there has gone up pretty much every year. They're close to that 40% mark each year. This country can produce some really good trophies, and hunters are starting to figure that out as these bucks get older. There's more and more of some of the local deer contests and Texas Big Game Awards entries that have some really high quality harvests that come from that ecoregion. And then even more specific, so at a finer scale than ecoregion, we could look at specific deer management units. So this one is Deer Management Unit 8 East, which is it's South Texas and it's the eastern half of South Texas. So you can see some trends there. They're around that 60% mark. So one of our better DMUs on that older buck harvest. But one thing to take a look at are what's the fawn crop in that ecoregion. You can see South Texas tends to have a lot of up and down years. South Texas and the Edwards Plateau and West Texas, they tend to be in perpetual drought conditions, and then they're interrupted with flooding. To where you get these really wet years or you get a really dry year. There's not a whole lot of years in between, but when you look at that fawn recruitment and compare it to their harvest, so that percentage is what was the fawn recruitment 4.5 years prior to that, because that would be those bucks that are being harvested. So you can see 2019 had a good fawn crop 4.5 years prior to that. But then as some of those seasons with low fawn crops caught up, that percent of the harvest of those older bucks tends to go down. But then as the fawn crop picks back up, that percent of the harvest also picks back up. So it's a lot of not only needing to have good habitat conditions that year, but you also have to be aware of what was the fawn production 4, 5, 6 years ago, because that's going to dictate how many older bucks you have available for harvest that season. We also have antler restrictions. Some of you may hunt in those counties. We mostly follow the DMU lines there, with a few exceptions on some counties that just had some younger bucks being harvested. But those magenta color counties, that's the original 6 counties they had the antler restrictions in, and then they were actually quite successful there. So they've been expanded to cover about 117 counties now, and it's been a very successful tool. For the most part, hunters appreciate that. They've seen those bucks get older. There's always some exceptions to things in which there may be an older buck that may not meet that minimum spread requirement, but just know that those bucks, it's not that they passed on poor genetics. It's just that that deer just isn't able to represent a big enough spread. But he's not going to produce narrow antlered offspring or anything like that. Breeding in whitetail is essentially completely random across all age classes. And some of the data that I'll have is going to show some of the reasoning for those antler restrictions. So in some other states, they have what we call APRs. It's an antler point restriction, in which they say you cannot harvest a deer unless it has 7 or more points or 8 or more points. But what happens with those restrictions is you actually end up removing a lot of very high quality 1 and 2 year old bucks. But with the inside spread, it tends to follow their age a lot better. So we actually end up protecting almost every 1.5 year old buck in those counties that have the antler spread requirements. And the vast majority of 2.5 year old bucks also get protected. But then once they get to 3 and older, almost every buck is going to reach a inside spread of at least 13 inches at some point in his life there. And looking at those 6 counties that it was first implemented in 2002, you can see back in the 90s, we were not very good hunters back then. I remember growing up and seeing some mounts in like my great uncle's or grandparents' house, and it's a pencil base, obviously a 1 or 2 year old buck, and he was a nice 8 point with probably a lot of potential. That's just the way hunting used to be back then, and it greatly altered the natural age structure of that herd. When you harvest 90% of deer or 90% of your bucks harvested are 2.5 and younger, it's going to have very big impacts. And Hunters began to take note of that later in the 90s. You can see those blue bars go down, but it wasn't enough. We're really looking at that 60% threshold. We would like less than 60% of the bucks harvested to be 2.5 and younger. So then in 2002, they implemented the antler restrictions there, and right away it had a significant impact. To where the last few seasons, they've been about 84% of bucks harvested have been 3.5 years or older, which is a great benefit for those counties with antler restrictions. We also collect data on Boone and Crockett scores. And if you weren't aware, the average buck in the state of Texas at maturity, which is 5.5 or older, is only about 124 inches. The Edwards Plateau averages about 118 inches, to where South Texas averages about 131 inches. And I know the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute has done a lot of this same research in South Texas, and their average Boone and Crockett score for a mature buck in South Texas is 130 inches. So that data lines up almost perfectly. And just one thing, as hunters, we often get sucked into seeing pictures in magazines or watching hunting shows where the focus is always on that 160 plus, that 170 plus. But if you look at the bell curve of that, and that's the actual bell curve of the data, you'll see such a small percentage actually fall into that tail on the bell curve. So really anything in that 130-inch class or bigger is going to be an above average buck in Texas. And it's best to focus on the age of that buck. And I know Dr. Rollins kind of talks about that every quail harvested is a trophy. Well, really, from a deer standpoint, every mature buck harvested should be viewed as that same way. Just the fact that that buck survived to be 5, 6, or 7 years of age without being harvested by that point is quite the feat for that deer to accomplish. And then when you look at those 180 plus, those are really your unicorns. It takes all the stars to align to really get some deer that can grow a set of antlers that scores that big. And looking at the statewide Boone and Crockett estimates for the different age classes. So you can see, obviously, as you guys all know, as deer get older, they grow bigger antlers. So those green, those are your mature bucks. Yellow, 4.5. The orange is 3.5, and the blue is 2.5. Those 2.5 and even your 1.5-year-old bucks as well, they're going to fluctuate a lot more from year to year because they're more dependent on environmental conditions. If it's a wet year, they're going to jump up. If it's a drought year, they're going to crash a lot more than some of those older age class bucks. But one thing to look at is the drought conditions. If y'all remember those drought conditions in 2022, we had severe drought conditions in the spring and the summer, and what impact that can have on Boone and Crockett scores. So just because of that 1 year drought, and it was so bad, we saw a dip in every age class on Boone and Crockett scores across the state. That's not to say that folks still did not harvest trophies. There's still trophies harvested every year. It's just the average across the board was much lower than it had been in prior years. But since then, we've had good rainfall conditions. We've had good fawn crops, and because of that, you'll see those Boone and Crockett scores start to climb as well. So when it comes to expectations for this upcoming season, it's kind of a mixed bag. We've had some drought conditions in the spring. You'll see that drought map back in April, where about 80% of the state was in some form of drought, and a very big portion of the state was either in severe or exceptional drought conditions in the spring. So that spring, that's really a time for antler development, and those bucks are putting on weight after the rut, and then they're putting those extra resources into antler growth. And that April, May, June rainfall is really the best correlation to look at when it comes to antler development. But then if we look at the drought map from last week, we'll see it's much improved. And actually, a few weeks ago, it was even better than this. But we've had some drought start to encroach on some different counties now. But this summer, we had really good habitat conditions. The temperatures were rather mild for Texas. We did not have any record-breaking stretch of 100-degree days, which we've been used to the last decade or so. So I would expect the fawn crop to be pretty good, but the antler development is going to be hit or miss just based off of where you are in Texas. Is the one thing to look at are what's the fawn crop 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago? Because those are going to be those bucks that everybody's going to be after this year. So those fawns born in 2018, those would be your 7.5-year-old bucks this year. And we had about average fawn crops those years, with a few of those years being a little bit above average statewide. So I would expect a pretty good mature age class within those 5, 6, and 7-year-old age classes this year. But then we will likely see a decrease in the number of 3.5-year-old bucks just due to the low fawn crop in 2022. And we should have quite a bit of deer in the young age classes, those 1.5 and 2.5-year-old bucks. And just more specifically looking at South Texas again, you can kind of lump those into the different age classes. So those 2018 through 2020 fawns, those would be your mature bucks this year. We had a really strong fawn crop those 3 years. Your middle age class is going to be kind of hit or miss. We should have a good number of 4.5, but not so many 3.5. And then we'll have a lot of young bucks, just like the statewide estimate, a lot of 1.5 and 2.5-year-old bucks this season. That doesn't mean you need to harvest those deer. That just means we have a lot of good deer with potential to be middle and then mature age down the road. So as far as expectations for this year, that South Texas and Edwards Plateau, they're kind of separated out from the rest of Texas. They're going to have a strong mature buck cohort, above average fawn recruitment, but probably average antler quality just because of those drought conditions in the spring. But don't forget that good deer management can still offset those drought conditions. There's a lot of hunters who do habitat work or some form of supplemental feed program that's going to help them offset those drought conditions and still be able to harvest a good number of trophy deer. But just across the board, the average in those two eco, or the average antler score in those two eco regions is going to be that 125 or so mark. But the rest of Texas is going to have a strong mature buck cohort, above average fawn recruitment, as well as above average antler quality. So I would definitely don't pass up an opportunity to go hunting this year, because this will be a great year to do so. As far as this season's info, if you were not aware, in January of this year, the Parks and Wildlife Commission adopted rules to get rid of the mandatory CWD zones. So we no longer have CWD zones, but we do have voluntary sampling. And I highly encourage you guys to reach out to your local biologist if you would like to sample. We also have some voluntary check stations and voluntary drop boxes. You can always take your deer there. If you don't know your biologist, you can always look it up on our website. And then I have the season dates there listed below. We have archery season as well as our managed lands deer program season kicking off this coming Saturday, the 27th. And for those of you guys that like to plan ahead for future years, you can go ahead in future years, and that archery and MLD will always start on the Saturday closest to September 30th. So some years it's going to be a September date, other years it may be an October date. And then that season will run for 5 weeks. And then the general season in both the North and the South zone starts the first Sunday of November, which happens to be November 1st this year. And then the North zone ends the first Sunday in January, and the South zone will end the third Sunday in January. And then depending on your zone, there's always some special late seasons as well as some early youth seasons and muzzleloader seasons as well. As far as new for this year, we also have a public-facing CWD dashboard. This is on our Parks and Wildlife CWD page, in which there's 3 different links you can click on this dashboard. The first one will show you our current season sampling. So that starts March 1st and runs through the end of February. You can go on there, you can zoom into your property, and then those samples, it's the samples are not logged with the location, but rather a grid system. And it will have a grid system and say there's been this many samples collected within this 3 mile by 3 mile grid. So you can always look buy your property and say, hey, there's people testing around me. I'm going to test as well, or maybe there's nobody testing. I would like to provide some testing there. But just remember, even if there is a positive there, there's no CWD zones now. So it's going to be more so, hey, there's a positive. These are some recommendations we would have for you. It's not a requirement. It's just a recommendation on what good deer management looks like. And at the end of the day, good whitetail management is also good disease management. So it's going to benefit everybody in the long run. There's also a map that will show the locations of those CWD positive deer. It'll have actual dot locations for the free ranging deer. Like you can see it in that map out in the west, in the Trans-Pecos, where those orange dots are. That's been the mule deer that have been positive there. And then those square diagrams, those are the breeding facilities that have been positive. And then that number in there is the number of deer that have been detected positive in that breeding facility. So you can use that map as a reference just to let you know how far or how close you may be to the nearest CWD positive. And then lastly on that page, there's some bar graphs and line graphs and things that just show the department's sampling efforts through time, as well as the number of CWD positive deer through time. And was it a free range? Was it a breeder deer? Was it on a release site? And so on and so forth. And then before I close out, this has kind of been new to a lot of people this last year, but is the New World Screwworm. If you were not aware, there was a communication from USDA Sunday night about 10:30 that they had a detection about 70 miles south of Laredo in Mexico in the state of Nuevo León. That was actually a 8-month-old heifer that was trailered to a feedlot there, and the heifer was trailered from deep South Mexico, where they have screwworm, and they found a wound when that animal was trailered there, and they treated it. They're going to drop flies there. When the staff there in Mexico have some amount of confidence that they'll be able to put it out there, and it may just be a one-off case. But obviously, us as an agency that oversees wildlife, there's always concern with that, and we've been doing some communication efforts on notifying people of that detection in Mexico. But this season, just as you're out hunting, or if you don't have a trail camera out already, you're very likely to put one out. Just keep an eye on anything you may see that is unusual, specifically open wound that is not healing, and you may or may not see maggots in it. But just any type of thing like that you see, contact your local biologist. And if you don't know their info, you can scan that QR code there, and it takes you to our website with their contact information. If you would like to Google it, you can just search TPWD find a biologist, and it's going to be that top link on top. But essentially, everybody's going to send that info to their biologist, and then that biologist will send it off to our wildlife veterinarians, and then we'll go from there on any type of diagnosis for that fly bin. As far as when to report, really any animal with the open wound that has larvae, that's the highest concern. Or it could be a very recently deceased animal within the last couple of hours, and it contains those larvae. Once you get beyond a few hours, those screwworm larvae actually fall out of the animal, and often what you see after that are those secondary flies. Like what you'll typically see, you'll see flies around a dead carcass, and you may see maggots on it. Those are those secondary flies that are not going to be a concern. But just this season, just kind of think about looking for any open wounds, specifically during the rut where those bucks begin to spar. That head and neck area is pretty prone to injuries. That's a picture of a key deer in Florida. They had a screwworm outbreak in 2016, and it happened during the rut. So most of their infestations were on the head area on those deer, because there was an open wound there for those screwworms to land there, lay eggs, and then hatch into larvae. Once the season ends, those deer will cast their antlers, or they'll shed their antlers. Just keep an eye on the antler pedicle. If you see a deer that pedicle has not healed over, that's cause for concern. During the fawning season, a doe's reproductive areas, when she gives birth, those are then exposed to screwworm to land there. as well as the fawn umbilical cord area. This is a very common infestation area in wildlife in which that fawn cannot really move around much on the first day it's born. So it's a common infestation area. But just kind of a public service announcement for this season. Just be on the lookout for that because screwworm has been on the top of about everybody's radar the last several months. And with that, Megan, I'll close out and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Or if you ever have any questions on anything, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a phone call. You can also text me on that number as well. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Blaze. So we had one question in the chat, and you touched on it as far as screwworm impact. Looking ahead, from a Parks and Wildlife or just a wildlife standpoint in general, what is Parks and Wildlife thinking as far as screwworms coming into next season? Could we potentially see um, season closures, reduced tag issuances or bag limits? What are we looking at, or what have y'all been seeing or hearing on the Parks and Wildlife front?
So it's definitely a cause for concern. So like as far as any changes from our regulations and things like that, then it's going to have to be once it gets here in Texas. Because if we start doing that now, it really just causes a lot of panic when it's not here. But it has been something we've discussed. So if screwworm were to get here, the Texas Animal Health Commission will put up infestation zones in which they'll have a circumference zone around the infected property. And what's good about reporting is if you report and you have screwworms, you will be the first one to get the sterile flies. So don't be afraid to report. It's encouraged to report because we can stomp it out a bit quicker, and you'll be getting the sterile flies on your property as well. Um, but as far as some changes, so whenever that it's detected here, we do have an authorization of take that those landowners can contact us and we can get them set up in which if they see a sick deer with an open wound, they're authorized to harvest that animal and they can do so outside of season and things like that. It does come with a simple reporting requirement. You harvest that, you let us know, hey, I used my permit, I harvested this deer. And then our staff can go out there and collect those larvae to make sure it is or is not screwworm. If it starts to get a bit bigger than that and we're unable to simply issue these authorization of takes, then what we'll likely do is have some form of a special season. Obviously, that's going to take a regulation change at the commission level, but that would allow people at a larger scale to be able to harvest whitetail as needed. But they have to have those infected wounds. They have to have larvae in them and we'll likely have some type of reporting requirement. We're thinking maybe something in our Texas Hunt and Fish app where many people have a digital license already. You could just report that, snap a picture of it, and upload the picture, and then our staff can reach out to you to go there and collect those larvae. If it really got bad and really started to hurt the population, that's when we would possibly look at any type of season changes or bag limits. We are a good ways from having to do that. It's obviously not here in Texas, but I do want everybody on the call to know it is part of our discussions. We are thinking about that.
Okay. Does Texas Parks and Wildlife have a screwworm, kind of a live screwworm tracking page? Do y'all put that out?
And so we have a screwworm website, but the only maps that are available is on the USDA APHIS website. And
Okay.
on the Parks and Wildlife screwworm webpage, there is a link to that APHIS website. And
Okay.
then if we did happen to get screwworms here, we would obviously have our reporting system set up for Wildlife. Animal Health Commission has their reporting system in which our staff will gather data and
Okay.
we'll have a map of those locations and work with both of those agencies along with USDA will work to have that available. But for the time being, those detection maps are going to be on the USDA website.
Okay. Good to know. That can be very easily found, everyone, via a Google search. I just did it. So it's easy to find. Um, I had a couple of questions that came up real quick. One being when we looked at all of your density harvest data, is that mostly collected using data collected from MLDP cooperators, or are you getting data from, the general hunting public as far as harvest, age of harvest, deer densities and things of that sort?
Mhm. So the deer density and the herd composition, which is the sex ratio and the fawn recruitment, that data is collected by our staff. So the
Okay.
herd composition is easy. They'll drive and on their way to property visits or even during property visits, they'll log this many bucks, does, and fawns, and it'll put it within that correct deer management unit. And when you collect thousands and thousands of data collections, it really starts to build a good picture of what that herd composition is. When it comes to those density estimates, our staff conduct hundreds of surveys each year. Those are going to be, it's a spotlight survey, but we use distance sampling, in which that distance sampling is able to, the distance sampling allows us to calculate for those deer that we do not see, which is how we're able to come up with those estimates. We obviously have MLD specific data, but those MLD surveys are specific to that property. It's not a good picture of the DMU as a whole because most of those MLD cooperators are heavily managing for white-tailed deer. So they tend to I just be a little bit out of the ordinary when it comes to what does the Edwards Plateau look like compared to those MLD guys that may be providing supplement. They may be um, building up their deer population, or they may be trying to lower it. So it's not a good indication looking at that, which is why we use those distance sampling surveys. And then the harvest data is collected from our staff, and it's a mix of data from ranches that our staff collect as well as from some taxidermists, as well as meat processors, in which they'll take the age of the deer and then take some antler measurements as well for us to use.
Okay, thank you. We had another question come up about regarding lengthening the North Zone deer season to match South Zone deer seasons. Has there been any recent discussion about revisiting that idea?
Mm. There's always discussion about that. Essentially, it hasn't been pursued right now. It was talked about a few years ago, and then ultimately, leadership in the commission decided not to pursue that. Not saying that it won't be pursued again, but essentially, the reason it's like that is because the South Zone hit decades ago used to start 2 weeks later. So then it ran 2 weeks further, so everybody had the same season. And then the commission adopted rules to standardize the start date, which is why they both zones now start on the same date, but they never changed the length of the south zone on the back end, which is why that south zone has 2 more weeks than the north zone. But it's definitely brought up every year. We just haven't pursued it right now.
Okay, thank you. All right, that's all we have for questions, unless anybody's got something last minute they want to go ahead and post in the chat. And if not, please again take down Blaize's contact information and feel free to reach out to him. He's a wealth of knowledge for all things big game in the state of Texas. Um, Before we leave, I would like to just remind everybody that this webinar, as well as the other webinars that we've hosted in past months, will be on our YouTube page in the Wild at Work playlist. So you'll be able to find this webinar within the next couple of days there on YouTube. And I'd like to really quickly plug our Wild at Work webinar for October. We will be hosting Jason Sawyer. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll be hosting Jason Sawyer from the East Foundation. He'll be discussing a framework for management decisions and action with regards to New World screwworm. So those of you who had screwworm questions, we'll be diving into that a little bit deeper next month in October. So we look forward to seeing all of you there. And thank you again, Blaize, for joining us today. Thank you, those of you who attended this webinar with us. We greatly appreciate it, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their Wednesday. Thank you.